Hi, folks. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. You're in the right place. This is the webinar on coal to clean, if I can use that word for a moment. We're just waiting for people to log on. You'll see the number at the bottom of participants slowly climbing. So give me a couple of minutes before I get going until the numbers climb. Okay, I think we might get started now. Letitia, it looks like we've got enough of our participants on board. Folks, welcome to this webinar today. This is about what we're calling our coal transition mechanism guidelines. Let me give you a bit of context for what we're doing. You're kind of aware of the carbon challenge, although I have to say, in a couple of conversations I've been having of colleagues the last couple of days, it's easy to get caught up in the short-term stuff and some of the short-term successes that we're having, renewable energy costs dropping like a stone, and forget that the race we're on is existential and terrifying. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Climate Change, is essentially telling us we have to get emissions down 50% by 2030 to have even a reasonable chance of having a future for our kids. It's not as if that's a stretch goal. It's not as if, oh, no, let's shoot for 50% by 2030, and then maybe if we don't get there, we'll settle for 20%. Yeah, those days are gone. We're now in this extraordinary race. We're seeing climate change cutting in. We now know that we're going to achieve, horrible term here, 1.5 degrees Celsius warming in realistically the next few years. We're at 1.2, getting on to 1.3 already. And our goal is to target 1.5, knowing it'll go up to 1.8, probably 2, probably 2.5. I'm horrified to have to say, because we're seeing such weak action on the part of countries around the world. Our goal is to stabilize and get it back down. We can only now do this with large quantities of direct air capture, of reforestation, and other forms of sequestration. There will be certain sorts of re-engineering, climate geoengineering that have to happen. David King at Cambridge University is talking about natural capital forms of global geoengineering, which is absolutely the way to go. But it's now, we can't avoid it. There's no way we can get our targets without tackling some very difficult things in the 2030s. In the meantime, we have to prepare for climate change, because it's coming down the road like a freight train at us, and it will start hitting us harder and harder in the coming years. The resilience agenda is something you'll hear a lot about from us from now on. And we need to make sure we really hit those climate emission reduction targets. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's changes across the board that we have to make: urban structure, industrial planning, industrial CapEx is going to be a big theme for the next few years, especially as things like the steel industry, 3/4 of the steel industry in China and Europe and Japan is coming up, all steel plants going to refurbish for the next few years. That's a big job we've got to do. In the energy sector, we are making progress. Things are changing, but we're not going fast enough. We still have a large coal fleet, way too large coal fleet. In fact, we're still building coal fleets, although we are now getting to the stage where we're stopping new contracts around the world, etc. And we've had some interesting developments about how maybe we can advance the closure of coal plants that exist now, particularly the old dirty ones, to try and improve our emissions threshold, which brings us to the topic of today's conversation. Context is, it's a disaster unless we act with the appropriate alacrity as laid out by the IPCC. We need to try everything. And I'm going to say everything. I don't think it's fair to say, no, we can't do that. It's not so good. Give it a shot. Today, we're talking about a situation where we're looking at coal decommissioning. Why we're looking at coal decommissioning? On one hand, there's the argument that, coal, look, it's going to be bankrupt in 20 years' time anyway, because of the drastic reduction in renewable prices we're likely to see and changes in energy patterns. But you know what? The thing is, anything we can do to advance that closure date is something we've got to tackle from an environmental perspective. I'm not talking about cost optimization. I'm not talking about the best pathway for pricing issues. I'm talking about simply, can we speed up in any way the reduction in emissions from energy transition? Now, we have seen some interesting discussions over the last couple of years about what I'd call credibly managed phase-outs of coal-fired power stations. We've seen more recently announcements as a result of a culmination of conversations for what's called the JETP. Tyler, I can never remember the acronym. You'll tell me about it in a minute. In South Africa and in Indonesia, where we now have in South Africa a reasonably well-developed plan, still details being sorted out, to support the financing of a transition in South Africa. And we have the sketch of a plan that's been announced in Indonesia with the participation of richer country governments and philanthropy and the Indonesian government on how we might go about advancing coal phase out in Indonesia. All this has raised a bit of a question for us at Climate Bonds. We are in the process of, always being asked to opine for investors around the world on the credibility of climate-related investments. We track, for example, every single green bond and also social and resilient bonds and sustainability linked bonds around the world, feed those into green bond and social bond indices, give the data to investors and so on, which requires us to have a call on whether an investment proposition is consistent with achieving our Paris Agreement targets. Question: are these proposals in South Africa or Indonesia consistent with achieving our Paris Agreement targets from an environmental perspective, and we're putting aside the cost optimization issues? And that led us into a project. We had discussions with our friends at RMI and then our friends at Climate Policy Initiative last year and then early this year in March at a meeting that Barbara Buchner had organised about how we take this question, how do we resolve it? And this has led us on this project to develop coal transition mechanism guidelines, which we've published and we're discussing today. This is a way of trying to provide appropriate guidance for investors, but also, frankly, for governments and other actors about what needs to be done at a minimum if we're going to have credible managed phase-out plans for coal-fired power stations. So it's an interesting area. Will it work? Don't know. I'm going to let you be the judge. At this stage, we're looking for feedback still. But one thing I can be certain of, we have to try it. We're called upon to try it, even though I hate the idea of bailing out coal-fired power stations, which is implied in a lot of these conversations. I hate the idea, hey, that's not the point of this. The point of this is to get emissions down, come what may, and deal with some of the other issues too, like just transitions and whatever. Well, you're going to hear me about today. Today, we have an exciting collection of speakers for you. We've got Ronan Hodge from the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. As you may know, that's an organisation representing some $130 trillion of banks and investors around the world. We've got Tyler Matsuo from RMI and Zofia Wetmanska from Climate Bonds Initiative. who will walk us through the set of guidelines that we've published and available. And you'll see some links being put in the chat to that in a minute, just so you can check it if you haven't already seen it. And then we'll hear from Coben Kalun, who's going to help moderate the thing and has also been running part of this project. And of course, we'll finish up with Barbara Buchner at Climate Policy Initiative. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being willing to entertain. Thank you for being willing to investigate, interrogate this particular idea. Interrogation is what it requires, but interrogation in the full knowledge that we have to act, we have to move, we have to try and do something on this. We just got to make sure it's credible. That's the game. On that note, I'm going to ask Ron to say a few words to get us going.
Great. And thanks very much, Sean, for that introduction. Just going to pull up some slides real quick. Hopefully that worked okay. So yeah, I'm Ronan Hodge, technical lead for the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ. GFANZ is a convening of the net zero alliances for the financial sector to help support the net zero committed financial institutions meet those commitments. And I know folks will want to get into the detail on the coal phase out guidelines, so I'll be quite brief. I mainly wanted to give a bit of context really to the importance of this work in supporting efforts that are about transitioning the economy to net zero, as Sean's touched on. So first of all, GFANZ's work on transition planning has identified these four key financing strategies to support the transition. And in particular, I want to focus on the fourth one here, the need for plans that really relate to the managed phase out of high emitting assets that may be needed in the near term, but need to be retired early in order to be compatible with society's climate objectives. And the reason this financing strategy is important is that early retirement of these high emitting assets can, should, and will play an important role in the decarbonisation. This chart comes from the International Energy Agency, and it shows that early retirement of emissive assets is a necessary element of how we decarbonise the economy, even this decade. It cuts off at 2030. I think that swathe there in grey at the top will only get thicker through following decades. If we don't do this and we continue to operate these assets, we'll blow through what remaining carbon budget that we have left that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. And so we need to take them out of the system at a pace that they can be replaced by low or no emission technology. So work within GFANZ really was a response to there being limited guidance on what appropriate transition planning looks like for these sorts of high emitting assets like coal power that we're discussing today. That need to be retired early, but also need to be operated in the near term while we manage that transition. Now, in the absence of such guidance, there's real pressure that we're seeing for net zero committed financial institutions to simply withdraw their finance from such assets and companies that own them, such as through divesting. And while this pressure can encourage decarbonisation, it can also have unintended consequences of actually prolonging the life of these assets, and indeed worsening their emissions profile if the provision of financing for them simply shifts to other actors who've got less climate ambition. So we really want them to stay with good stewards who are committed to climate change, mitigating climate change. Now, particularly in the context of oil and gas assets, which often transfer around a lot, some analysis by the Environmental Defence Fund found that the flow of assets has been significantly to those with lower environmental commitments, such as net zero targets. So it's a bit of a bellwether of what we might see more generally in this space. So as I say, instead, we need to ensure that there is a net zero aligned approach via which such assets can be financed and ensure they're responsibly stewarded out of the economy. So our report that came out back in the summer aimed to begin filling that gap. But it was essentially trying to set out this concept, and it identified various work that would be needed to make this a credible approach that also avoids concerns with greenwashing. And importantly, I recognised that the need for respected voices to help establish the guardrails here. And so we really strongly welcome this work that's been discussed today as really helping set out the features of what you'd want to see in a coal phase out plan, to have the confidence that it's supporting emissions reduction in the real economy, because as Sean says, that's what this is all about ultimately. We need to get those emissions down. And I think these guidelines, give a real basis to see coal phase-out strategies be put in place. In particular, we're quite closely involved in the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that Sean mentioned, and other country platforms, which can hopefully be a way of starting to provide a point of practical implementation of guidelines such as these, as we see various countries look to move from what are often very coal-dominated power systems to take advantage of that much cheaper renewable energy and manage that shift. There are, in the paper, the guidelines are great at setting out some of the reasons why the pure economics there doesn't simply kind of make that work overnight, and then we need to actually work with these situations to unlock the benefits essentially of that. And just to one of Sean's points, I genuinely believe that if we look at a lot of these situations, we will see that the upfront investment costs of making this decommissioning of the coal and bringing in new renewable energy systems will more than be paid for by the net benefits that we see in terms of lower costs for the power system, but also health and other benefits, jobs, etc., that will come from making that transition, more competitive economies and so forth. So I think this paper most instructive in terms of helping unlock some of those aspects that enable us to kind of benefit from those gains, as well as making this really important shift that's going to support climate change mitigation. So finally, just to plug a few things to be looking out for as other pieces of work from us. In coming weeks, colleagues in RMI are going to be putting out some work on metrics and targets in relation to coal phase out. What are the sorts of aspects there that are going to be needed to be seen that supports these guidelines as well as some of the financing mechanisms that can help support this? How do we draw on things that have been done already in different contexts? How do we think about new innovative approaches that allow you to kind of pull forward that time frame for coal phase out? And second, GFANZ, through its Asia Pacific network, is also looking to establish a work stream that draws together this various practical guidance on coal phase out for that region in particular, and really support the JETP processes Sean mentioned. These are active in South Africa and Indonesia, was announced recently, and we expect Vietnam to be announced very shortly as well. So it's I think that'll be an exciting space. But I'll just say thank you again for your time. I'll hand over to Tyler, who's going to talk through the work in more detail, but happy to take questions later in the seminar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ronan. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Tyler Matsuo. I'm a manager with RMI's carbon-free electricity team, and I'm joined by my colleague at CBI, Sophia Wetmanska. And we'll be talking through the set of guidelines that we, along with other colleagues at RMI, CBI, and CPI, have developed that kind of look at how we can assess the credibility of financing mechanisms that support a managed phase out of coal. As we're going through the presentation and as questions come up, please feel free to submit any questions through that Q&A function on Zoom. We'll try to answer as many as we can kind of in real time, and then we'll also have some time at the end to get to any questions we didn't get to. And I believe Leticia also has linked the link to the landing page if anybody wants to download the full working paper and have some light reading over their holiday break. Great. Sophia, could we go to the next slide, please? Perfect. So before I dig into the guidelines themselves, I just want to take a minute and answer the question of why finance. So as Sean was saying, even with a lot of the volatility in energy markets and supply chains that we've seen over the past year or so, I think the fundamental story still remains true that clean energy and renewables will continue to grow and are increasingly economic compared to existing coal. So really helping to push out coal in a lot of the competitive electricity markets. However, we've also estimated that around 90% of coal capacity today is actually in markets where it's shielded from competition from cleaner and cheaper energy through things like utility regulation or long-term contracts like power purchase agreements. So financial mechanisms are a tool that can help manage the phase out of these plants, accelerating their closure while at the same time helping preserve financial and regulatory stability that will be really important for mobilizing finance and creating that enabling environment we need for that broader energy transition, while at the same time helping ensure that we have some provisions as well for a just transition for workers, communities, and other stakeholders that could be negatively affected by a coal transition. Next slide, please, Sophia. So given the potential for finance in the coal to clean transition, it's been really exciting to see a lot of momentum behind financing mechanisms over the past year. This slide is by no means comprehensive, but just shows sort of a snapshot of some of the major announcements and pilots and deals have come out. I think most recently and kind of big news was some of the JETP announcements, Just Energy Transition Partnership announcements at COP and G20 even just last month. Next slide, please. Great. So yeah, as we can continue to see announcements like these and as deals continue to move toward piloting and implementation, it's also important to recognize that financial mechanisms also carry pretty key risks that could undermine their ability to really deliver on their intended outcomes. So when we're talking about risk, the risks that we really focused on when developing these guidelines were not necessarily financial risks, or I think Ronan called it that financial viability, but really the reputational and credibility risks of some of these deals. So this could include, a risk that the deal doesn't actually deliver the climate outcome that it intended, or that it could undermine kind of that long-term environmental integrity. So we wanted to make sure that we were developing some guidelines that would both ensure that deals are delivering direct emissions impact, but also that they aren't creating challenges or distorting kind of future incentives or creating emissions lock-in that could be problematic for achieving those long-term climate goals. There's also potential risk to workers, communities, and other stakeholders that could be negatively affected by a coal transition. And then the kind of final risk that we looked at was just recognizing that there's a lot of general optics risks of providing financing to coal plant owners. So I wanted to provide a framework for funders and financial institutions to be able to demonstrate kind of a positive impact with their involvement in these coal transition deals. So to address some of these risks and to address some of these challenges, CBI, CPI, and RMI, we've been working over the past several months to develop a set of initial guidelines to help assess the climate and social credibility of coal transition deals. We've aimed to develop these in consultations with stakeholders, really spanning the public, private, and civil society space, really with the aim of trying to thread the needle between developing guidance that is both stringent from the kind of climate, environmental, and social perspective, but is also going to be pragmatic and can be implemented on the ground. So to that end, we want to say just a few words about what these guidelines are and what we envision they'll be used for. So the first is that these are really guidance and recommendations, and right now they're not a hard standard. So in their current form, we really believe that these could help inform the design of deals or kind of the structuring of transactions, and generally be used as sort of an engagement and assessment tool for financial institutions and funders and coal plant owners that are exploring some of these coal transition mechanisms. The second thing we want to flag is that we currently focused on identifying a minimum bar for environmental and social integrity. So if you look at the working paper itself, you'll see that we've situated each guideline on a spectrum of ambition. And our goal with this iteration of the guidelines is both to set really clear guidelines and guide rails for impact, but at the same time, making sure that we're creating the space for deals to move forward to kind of support that learning by doing process. I think we recognize that there's probably a lot that we still don't know and a lot of nuance, and allowing that process and allowing that experience, I think, will only kind of help shape future guidelines moving forward. And then finally, the last thing kind of to this point, these are not static guidelines. I think we're viewing these very much as kind of living guidelines. So we'd expect over time that some of these guidelines would ratchet in their ambition and that they'd probably need to be adapted to different contexts and applications. So I think all that being said, what we actually hope that these guidelines are is provide a helpful framework for thinking about and organizing some of the main credibility challenges and providing a starting place for how they can be addressed. Next slide, please. Great. So digging into the guidelines themselves, we've organized them into a series of 4 what we call stage gates, with several guidelines kind of sitting under each. That first stage gate really looks at coal plant eligibility. So asking the question, is it credible to provide transition finance for the coal plant? And this has kind of 2 components to it. First is making sure that finance adds additional value to the coal transition. And second, that it doesn't create future incentives or outcomes that would undermine climate goals. The second stage gate looks at what coal transition pathways would be considered credible. And it's really focused on ensuring that there are sufficient backstops in place, really to give confidence that a transaction is actually achieving a positive climate impact. The third stage gate is focused on a just transition for workers, communities, and other stakeholders that could be affected by the coal transition. The provisions that we have, I think, have more of a goal of social protection and mitigating negative impacts. And then the fourth stage gate is really about disclosure, governance, transparency, and making sure that a lot of the coal transition deals are providing accountability to actually achieving some of their non-financial outcomes. Next slide, Sophia. Great. So our first guideline, which sits under the coal plant eligibility category, it recommends limiting financing mechanisms to coal plants that reached financial close or final investment decision prior to the Glasgow Climate Pact. As you can see on our graph on the left here, this would make pretty much the lion's share of coal plants operating or under construction eligible today, but it would increasingly restrict eligibility of plants in earlier stages of the pipeline. And the reason why we've put this type of guideline in place is really to manage moral hazard risk. So what I mean by moral hazard is the risk that, you know, the expectation or the possibility of receiving financial support in the future for the coal transition could distort or encourage investment in coal today. So really making sure that we're not kind of creating these perverse incentives. Within this guideline, we've drawn our line at financial close, both because it's really a clear threshold that is kind of less easily gained, but also recognizes that plants at later stages of the pipeline could face pretty significant liability if they were abandoned. And then COP26 or the Glasgow Climate Pact, we've also chosen as kind of an important threshold for managing this moral hazard risk, both because it was the first time that we really saw international consensus on the need to phase down coal globally. And it was also the venue for several announcements of financial packages and financing mechanisms for the coal transition. So that included the Just Energy Transition Partnership, ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism, and SIF's Accelerating the Coal Transition Investment Program. So that is the first guideline within coal plant eligibility. The next slide, we have our second guideline within coal plant eligibility, which recommends that finance only support coal plant owners that have an entity level commitment to no new coal development or procurement globally. I think this one is relatively obvious. It really helps ensure that deals aren't supporting a coal plant owner that is continuing to build new coal. I think we recognize that is a pretty major risk, both just from the optics perspective, but also from the climate impact and leakage perspective. I will say that while we were developing these guidelines, we had a lot of discussion internally and externally about whether it would be appropriate to include more kind of entity level expectations around climate commitments and transition planning. And while we haven't included them in this iteration of the guidelines, it's definitely an area where we see a particular need for ratcheting ambition over time, where by 2030, it could be reasonable to expect climate aligned target setting and transition planning at that entity level. Next slide. So the final guideline related to coal plant eligibility is that the fair value of a coal plant should be positive at the time of the proposed coal transition. So this is really about making sure that finance isn't actually supporting stranded assets and that there's a real actual need for solutions to accelerate its phase out. I think this guideline is pretty straightforward in theory, but we also recognize that it could be challenging in practice, given some of the subjectivity and assumptions that come with asset valuation. So I think in putting forward this guideline, in the working paper, we do have some recommendations about the different types of valuation approaches based on IFRS standards that could be appropriate depending on market and ownership structure. But I think more importantly, I think we're trying to get at that transparency in valuation approaches and some transparency in the assumptions behind those approaches is really important for the credibility of some of these mechanisms. I think I hand over to Sophia now.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Yeah, and I'm happy to cover the rest of the guidelines. As you will be able to see, what we have in mind and what we are thinking about is that transition pathways could look differently. So we want to allow for flexibility, but at the same time, we want to provide enough requirements or criteria to prevent backsliding and to not achieving the climate impact. So the guideline 4 is around 1.5 aligned coal phase out deadline. And if that's met, then that's okay. If that's not met, then we would perceive that deal to be of high risk. If it is actually in line with the coal phase out deadlines, aligned with the science-based pathways, then the second consideration we take into account is whether it's going to be replaced by a portfolio of clean resources that provide equivalent electricity services. Again, if that's met, then we can show the climate impact that we are looking for at already a plant level, which is essentially what Sean and Ronan and all of the previous parties were mentioning. That's our goal. But if that's not met, then there's still that flexibility on our end that we wanted to capture, that it can be met at the energy system level. So then we go into guideline 5 that looks whether the CDM does not allow to extend the lifetime of unabated coal combustion, and that's really important. We do not want to allow CDMs to support the phase out, or even if decreasing the emissions, the prolongation of the lifetime of the asset. If it's not prolonging the life, then the final consideration would be if it's not meeting if it's not being replaced at the asset level by clean resources, do we have enough safeguards at the system level? Do we have enough commitments and ambitious plans at the system level to be sure that it is going to enable the 1.5 aligned transition pathway? So this is our end goal. This is to have that credibility either at the plant level and enough safeguards at the system level. Then that's good enough for us. Again, this decision tree is very much simplified version of a lot of conversations that we have over time. So please do refer to the details of it. But the main message here for guidelines 4.6 is that we want to see the change happening in line with 1.5 pathway, but we do not want to restrict on how this change is happening. But we do have enough backstops in place and safeguards in place to make sure that there's no leakage or carbon lock-in. Tyler has mentioned before that we are not only looking at the climate impacts, but also social impacts of that transition. And although we do understand that just transition is a very complex process that is not only happening at the asset level, but does have to engage in cooperation at the regional and national levels. We do recognize that the asset level is where the companies do actually have the greatest influence. So at the moment, that's this sort of minimum requirement or minimum guideline on our end to know that to ask for actions such as advance notice and communication, stakeholder consultations and dialogues early on, packages reskilling for affected workers, impact assessment, and actions that would prevent the negative outcomes of the transition or mitigate that outcomes, and remediation and reclamation. These are very fundamental actions. You will see them across the existing frameworks around just transition. And we do encourage, as Tyler has mentioned, these guidelines do have a comprehensive scope, but the depth of each of the components is a sliding scale that where we showed what we ask for as a minimum, as a starting point for further discussions. Then to move forward to the transparency and accountability process and the guideline aid. This is mostly to make sure that all of these requirements, how they can be presented and how they can be met. Again, this is we have identified the minimum requirements, but again, as Tyler has mentioned, over the years, we already know how the trends are evolving, and we know that this minimum is not going to last for long, and a lot of different frameworks and deals will ask for higher stringency and more comprehensive reporting and accountability mechanism. But to show you what we think is the minimum for the coal plant eligibility, determination of that coal plant eligibility, we ask for entity level public commitment to no new coal. This is very much fundamental when it comes to CTMs. Coal transition pathways, again, this comes back to the guideline where initially the coal transition pathway, the role of finance that is going to play in that, in making sure that the pathway becomes reality, and generation self carbon credits. These we see as a minimum, but this will evolve very quickly over time, and we can expect investors and interested parties basically being very much on the more stringent side of things. Social protections, then we want to see how the plans, the just transition plans at the asset level in the future, but initially the description on how the just transition is being considered within part of the CTM and how it's being attached to further actions in the future. And finally, accountability. This is the basic incentive structure on how what's going to happen if some of the requirements are not going to be met over time, and how to present how these are being met over time and in line with the plans that are being set for CTM. So annual reporting against climate and social outcomes is very much going to be quickly required as more of these deals come live and as CTMs become even more popular. Then, as you can imagine, and as you've heard before, this is a starting point for the discussions around CTMs. This is the discussions we had were much more complex that the guidelines can handle at this point. So we have identified areas of future work. We know that there's an interest in investment frameworks on how these guidelines can inform taxonomies, credit systems, and standard systems. So that's something that is important and worth investigating. Then we know we aimed at making the guidelines as universal as possible. However, each deal happening in different geographies are going to have local specificities attached to it. So it will be interesting and important to see how these guidelines can be applied to specific deals happening on the ground that we are witnessing and will be witnessing more in the future, as been announced during the COP and G20 meeting. And finally, there's a lot of interest around carbon offsets for CTMs and how they can be linked between the credible carbon offset system and and the phase out process. So that's something that we know there's a lot of work going on currently, and how that can support the achievement of the net zero at the economy levels. For now, we have focused on the climate impacts, but we have not linked that strictly to the discussion around financial architecture of such deals. So we see that the guidelines have the potential to inform metrics for financial institutions, and this is of interest to private sector, and all the deals are happening between private and public sector as well. So we think that's these are just a couple of the areas of future work that we have identified based on the discussions we had with stakeholders, but we very much look forward to hearing more feedback. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Coben to address outstanding questions and lead the discussion. I'm not sure, Coben, are you with us?
I am here, and thank you so much, Sophia, Tyler, Sean, and Ronan. Very productive conversation. We are starting to have some questions populate in the Q&A, but if you have more, please definitely let us know and just go ahead and add it there. The first question is directed to you, Tyler, and basically gets into what is the indicator to ensure finance adds value in coal plant eligibility guidelines. So I don't know if you want to take a turn at that question, and we can always add in.
Sure, I'm happy to start. Yeah, I think when we develop these guidelines, as we've said kind of several times, is sort of setting that minimum guide rail for adding value. And in this case, what we've done is basically mostly looked at ensuring that that coal plant wouldn't have been retired necessarily without that financial transaction. So I think that's tried to be captured within that fair valuation approach. So recognizing that, you know, there are certain plants that might have a long-term contract, like a power purchase agreement, that even if that coal is not actually competitive with clean energy, it's still kind of like locked into the energy system through that contract. I think the same can be said for certain coal plants that have regulated returns in certain regulated electricity markets, where without that financing mechanism or without some sort of mechanism in place, these coal costs can just continue to be passed on to electricity customers. So making sure that we're kind of capturing the scenarios where finance can actually play a role in accelerating the closure of plants that otherwise have no incentive to close. I think there is a lot of super interesting work going on that looks at how we might prioritize the phase out of a fleet of coal plants within an electricity system that looks at different factors like efficiency, electricity system reliability, just transition aspects. So kind of running a huge spectrum of different factors that electricity planners and policymakers would really care about. And I think that work is both incredibly important, but also not something that would necessarily be dictated by funders and financial institutions doing some of these deals. So we haven't kind of waded into how one would go about prioritizing that or sequencing that fleet transition. Others on my team and want to add anything?
No, I think it's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Tyler. I guess next, maybe I'll just open up a question and start to go around the panel, so to speak. So Ronan, maybe I'll come to you next, and just wanted to maybe have you provide some additional perspective and context. In particular, I think we saw a lot of announcements, commitments, and other kind of news coming out of COP27, G20, both around JETPs, but also some individual deals. ADB announced the Chirvan 1 plant. There's some news around, obviously, commodity in South Africa. How are you seeing financial institutions respond? And I guess any additional perspective on what you think might be needed as it relates to the guidelines or beyond around how to mobilize additional transition capital?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think the way I've sort of seen certainly our work and the financial institutions kind of path on this area. Last year and in the lead up to Glasgow, there was an awful lot of momentum in the commitments made. those commitments made through frameworks, alliances that gave people about 12 to 18 months to figure out how they'd turn that into targets. And, you know, for some, they were still figuring out how they even measure their emissions from a financial sector perspective as well. So the Insurance Alliance has only just put out for consultation a sort of protocol on that. So those targets are now coming into place. We've seen throughout this year, as well as firms put them out. So I think as we move forward, a lot of this is now about putting that into action. And so a lot of what we've been doing this year is trying to make sure that the financial institutions have a clear sense of what good transition planning looks like, what sort of expectations are around targets, metrics, how they demonstrate progress, and so forth. And I think it's been really important that we've kind of tried to set out from our perspective, for our members, what transition finance looks like that is actually about decarbonising the real economy. And I think that's why this piece on managed phase out is a really important element of that. And I think that's then providing the basis for these sort of stakeholder arrangements, these platforms and so forth, that bring together different parties with different objectives, but some core objectives that are shared to move forward on this. And I think that's what some of the announcements that you mentioned, Coben, have been around. I mean, if I take the JETPs in particular, this idea you bring together a country trying to figure out how it's going to finance its process of transitioning its energy sector, essentially, in order to meet its NDCs. You've got multilateral development banks coming in to support that. You've got local financial institutions, different government departments. And I think what we're trying to do is make sure that we kind of help support that system and framework and you know, what the plan or the strategy around that looks like, in order that international finance can play a role there as well. And so I think that recognition that there's a lot of stakeholders in this space and people actually now willing to get down to the actual detail on this stuff has been the main thing that we're now starting to see push forward. And I think it's work like this on these guidelines where it gets more granular about, okay, these are the elements that we're going to need to see that's really going to help cut through that. And this work will really complement stuff that's probably a bit easier in terms of how do you support the kind of scale up on the renewable side, but these two things kind of need to come together and so forth. But I think that's, now that we've got the sort of different ingredients in place here and we've got some sense of what credibility looks like, and hopefully we start to see more people as well kind of give a view on what credibility looks like. I don't think that would be for GFANZ to do, be like marking our own homework to some degree. I think that those are sort of the elements that will help pull this together, and we get these groups of stakeholders working together, and not just in that context of a country's transition. I think we'll see it on different technologies and so forth as well, which will be really interesting. So those are sort of areas that we're excited about, and we're hoping to see start to actually mobilize capital. And this time next year, hopefully we can have been celebrating some serious movements of dollars and other currencies to kind of get climate finance moving. And I look forward to the Climate Policy Initiative's annual go at figuring out what those flows look like as well, and hope to see some progress there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ronan. And maybe just to pick up on one topic that you started to touch on there, maybe first, Tyler, see if you have a few words on this, and then would love to invite Jonathan first from CPI to come in, given some experience working in South Africa. But on this topic of transition planning, Tyler, is anything more that you'd want to share about kind of what we're seeing from utilities as they're stepping into transition planning? And then based on the conversations that we had in developing the guidelines report, any additional thoughts on how and where utilities can really step into advancing their efforts in this area?
I'm happy to weigh in, but welcome others. I know CBI has also been working quite a bit on the topic of kind of entity level transition planning. The main things I'll say, and some of what we were considering from the utility specific perspective, was really around some of that forward-looking resource planning or CapEx planning, both like, what kind of investments are going to be made, but also on that managed phase out side of how are we actually planning our electricity systems, and how are we making investments to support that clean energy transition for the sector. And I guess, I don't know, the only thing I'd add is maybe just some nuances that have been interesting to see around how emission scope is defined for the sector, and ensuring that things like purchased power for, a state-owned entity that may be purchasing coal-fired generation from IPPs is included both in that transition planning process, as well as the commitments. But I'll turn it over and see if Jonathan or Sophia have anything to add.
I'll just say something in general about the entity's approach we're taking, which could be relevant here, and then let Sophia opine specifically on the coal, the CTM mechanism. So we'll be launching next month transition entity certification. This is something that RMI has been involved in helping developing in different sectors, or at least developing the background reference benchmarks. Our view is there's a couple of different ways of looking at the certification or the recognition of investments that are in line with the Paris Agreement. I mean, first, they were just, let's call them fossil fuel companies doing green stuff, building fossil fuels. We've got to recognize some of that and some guidelines to that. There's also this is all the use of proceeds, green bond model. There's use of proceeds for investments that may not look green at first, but are relevant to green. This could be things like retrofitting gas pipelines to make them hydrogen ready. And there's a few things along those lines. We have provided guidance in many sectors, but most importantly around entities. If you're a company that is already below a reference benchmark, notably in the steel sector, we've chosen to, with the advice of RMI, to choose the IEA's net zero pathway for steel. If you're a company that was already below that and reducing emission threshold, you would get a certification as a company, effectively a green company. But if you're a company that is planning to get below the reference benchmark with a suitable level of ambition, that is, single-digit years rather than double-digit numbers of years, then you would be able to get a label as a transition entity. And there's a few other caveats and rules around all this. We're bringing this in to apply to property, to shipping, to steel, to chemical, to cement, where we have reference benchmarks already. Now, in this particular today's topic, it's conceivable, we haven't actually got to that stage yet, I don't think, Sophia, that we could look at an entity which is making adequately ambitious changes in line with these criteria that would be able to get a transition certification as an entity, as distinct from specific investments. Well, at least that's the background idea, but maybe I better go to Sophia, who's across the detail now.
Thanks a lot, Sean. I know Jonathan was waiting to answer, but I saw there is a question about taxonomy, so maybe I'll jump after Jonathan to answer that.
Thanks and good afternoon, everyone. So I think South Africa was very important in the influencing and the forming of this guidebook for a number of reasons. I mean, we're all very aware of the $8.5 billion, which is very much focused on just energy transition. South Africa, coal is very, very sensitive and very politicized. And also a number of the coal-fired power stations have no choice but to be decommissioned. So that was an important aspect. Also, of course, all the coal-fired power stations are owned by one utility. So it was a different model from perhaps other countries. But I think most importantly, where we had to take cognizance was the fact is what is just energy transition from a community point of view? Because it was pointed out to us very early on in devising this rule book that if you do not get the communities to transition, no energy transition program would work. And what that means is that a coal miner or a person working in a coal-fired power station, they're all patently aware of the dangers of living in those communities. They've all seen people die from ill health, but it pays for education, it pays for food, and it pays for clothing. So until such time as they can be convinced that let's call it a renewable energy job, can give them security, it is going to be very difficult to transition these communities. So I think that was very, very important in terms of us putting together this guideline is, how do we address it from the community level? There was one other aspect that I think you came into quite a lot of debate when we were doing the rulebook, and that's gas as a transition fuel. And we had to take that into consideration because, for example, a number of South African financial institutions will fund gas, but only if it's in a transition, if it's as a transition fuel. So that's very important, and hopefully gives a bit of perspective on the South African aspect of the rulebook and how it influenced our thinking. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot.
let's go to you next, Sophia.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the question about the taxonomy and the transition finance. And the question was around the traffic light system taxonomy that identifies the transition finance. And just to clarify or maybe shed light, there's not that many traffic light system taxonomies as of yet. That is a very hot topic now in the discussion around development of taxonomies. And only, I think, Indonesian one and Singaporean one are the only ones that have showed the approach and how it could look and what it is. And I think what's the most important part about this is not whether the question is asking whether the coal phase out guidelines could be treated as green finance. I think this is not exactly it. I think this is why you've got a transition finance, and that's how it could be defined and what's the difference between transition finance and green finance. Green finance is where it's supposed to address these types of economic activities or assets that are going to be part of 2050 economy. And transition finance is, or the amber category in the taxonomies as you wish, is supposed to bring assets closer to that green threshold or help to transform the economy, while not necessarily being green at the outset. So this is very much the concept of transition finance, and I think this has proven to be a big challenge when we are developing taxonomy for Singapore, where I think there's that challenge of making sure that transition finance is no worse than green finance. It's equally important, and there's a very limited number of assets that are already green, and we will require a lot of new instruments and new funds and new financial flows that will help to transition. So I don't think it is. I think it is really important to emphasize that green finance is equally important as transition finance, and transition finance is no less, is no worse than the green finance. And that's why I think the taxonomy, the traffic light system taxonomy is going to help to identify that and to help to address this challenge in making sure that transition finance is seen and supported, because that's the real challenge. It's not really supporting what's green, but making sure the economy transforms.
Great, thank you, Sophia. Well, we're running short on time, so I did want to hand over the mic to Barbara Buckner from CPI to close this out. Thank you all for the great questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Koben, and many thanks to the whole team for a great conversation. And again, to all of you for your interest, for your engagement, and for your questions. Again, just, why are we here today? I think we wanted to put the guidelines together to really help provide both a framework for thinking about the specific credibility challenges of financing a managed phase out of coal, but also to put forward an initial set of recommendations on how these challenges can be navigated. So in developing them, we built off a lot of existing great work in this space, and we also benefited from inputs from a wide range of organizations, including obviously from Ronan and GFANZ. But I really wanted just to take a moment here to acknowledge that and thank many of you for your input and your help. We do hope that by consolidating these recommendations, these guidelines can start to inform the implementation and the design of coal transition deals in countries such as those through the JETB in Indonesia, in South Africa, and in Vietnam, but also create the space for a broader range of financial stakeholders to engage in coal transition deals. So I think, in other words, it's now time to test the guidelines and to continue updating them. We do believe that creating this space for learning will be critical, as there's still a lot we do not yet know about the challenges of deals and of solutions to address them. Amongst others, also in India, in our CPI work, we're doing a lot of operationalizing just transitions. It would be great to exchange thoughts on that and to really learn from each other. And so to that end, as also others have already said, we see these guidelines as an initial starting point, but recommendations that will evolve as we build collective knowledge and experience about the coal transition and as we increase our climate ambition. So please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions or to discuss further. We also will be posting a recording of the webinar following the session for any colleagues that weren't able to make it today. And we do look forward to continuing this conversation and this learning exercise together with you. So with that, thanks again to all of you. Let me wish you happy holidays, a restful break, and I hope you all have a wonderful start into the new year. And thanks all.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.